My son stood up in a courtroom, in front of a judge, in front of strangers, and told them that I could not be trusted to read my own bank statements. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. Calm, a little tired, as if it pained him to have to say it about his own mother. What he did not know, as he stood there in his good grey suit, was that I had read every statement that account had ever produced. For 40 years, reading other people's statements had been my whole job. And by the time he spoke those words out loud in that quiet room, I had already done the one thing that would undo all of it. He just hadn't found out yet. My name is Eleanor. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a small white house at the edge of Marietta, Ohio, where the river bends and the freight trains still run at night. I worked 38 years as a bookkeeper. Numbers were never cold to me. They were honest. They tell you the truth even when people won't. And there was one thing 40 years of keeping the books taught me that no one ever takes from you, no matter how old you get. I'll come to it. But to understand why it mattered, you have to understand what they were trying to take. And to understand that, you have to know what I gave first. So let me start where it really begins, which is long before any judge. I married Harold when I was 22. He drove a delivery route for a bakery and smelled like warm bread when he came home. And he had a laugh that filled a kitchen. We bought this house in 1976 for $19,000, with a porch that sagged and a furnace that groaned. And we spent the next 4 decades making it ours. I papered the hallway 3 times. He built the shelves in the den with his own hands. There's still a pencil mark on the doorframe in the kitchen where we measured our boy every birthday. Our boy, David. He was an easy baby and a sweet child. What came later does not erase that. I packed his lunches. I sat in the cold metal bleachers at every junior high baseball game, even when he never left the bench. When he wanted to go to college and we didn't have it, I took a second set of books to keep at night. Small businesses around town, a hardware store, a dentist, a flower shop on Front Street. I balanced their accounts at my own kitchen table after David was asleep. And that money went into a coffee can, and then into a savings account, and then into his tuition. I'm not telling you this to sound like a saint. I'm not one. I'm telling you so you'll understand the size of what I gave. It matters. There's a winter I think about more than the others. David was 11, and the furnace gave out in January. The real cold. The kind that puts frost flowers on the inside of the windows. We didn't have the money to fix it and feed 3 people both, not that month. So Harold and I slept under every quilt we owned in the front room near the wood stove. And we kept David's room warm, and we never once let him know there was a choice being made. He woke up warm every morning that winter. That's what a parent does. You carry the cold yourself, so the child never feels it. I would do it again tomorrow. I would do it again every winter of my life. I also want you to know I was never a foolish woman with money. Not once in my life. I clipped coupons I didn't need to clip. I drove the same blue Buick for 16 years and kept the receipts for every oil change in a shoebox in the closet. When other women my age were letting their husbands handle the accounts, I handled ours, and his mother's too. And after she passed, I handled the estate so cleanly, the lawyer asked if I'd done it before. Money was never a mystery to me. It was a language I was fluent in. For most of those 38 years, people in Marietta knew me as the woman who kept the books straight. When the hardware store on Green Street nearly lost everything to a bookkeeper who'd been skimming, it was me they brought in to find where the money had gone. And I found it, down to the last $100, in an afternoon. When the church needed someone honest to count the collection, they asked me. And they asked me for 19 years running. I sat on the library board. I did the taxes for half the widows on my street, free of charge, because they were widows, and so was I. And we look after our own. None of that is to boast. I list it so you'll understand the size of the lie that was about to be told about me. They were going to stand in front of a judge and call the most careful woman in the county a fool. And for a while, they almost made it true, just by saying it loud enough. Harold got sick when David was already grown and married. It was his heart, and then his kidneys, and then it was everything at once. I cared for him at home for 2 years. I learned to change dressings. I learned the names of 9 different pills and the exact hours each one was due. I slept in a chair beside his bed so I'd hear him if he called in the night. And when he passed, on a Tuesday morning in March, with the light just coming up grey over the river, I held his hand, and I told him I'd be all right. I meant it. I am a capable woman. I have always been a capable woman. David came to the funeral with his wife, Sherry, and their 2 children, and he cried, and I held him, and for a little while I thought grief might bring us closer. His business was a contracting outfit, building decks and additions, and he'd always talked big about it. I didn't ask many questions. A mother doesn't always want to know. The first crack was so small, I almost didn't feel it. It was about 3 months after the funeral. David came by on a Sunday, alone, and we sat on the porch with iced tea. And he was quiet in a way that wasn't like him. Then he said, careful as a man stepping onto ice, "Mom, have you thought about what you're going to do with the house? It's a lot for one person." I said it was my home. He nodded and let it go. But something in the way he'd asked stayed with me after his truck pulled out of the drive. It wasn't concern in his voice. It was arithmetic. Let me stop here just for a moment, because I'd like to know who I'm sitting with tonight. Wherever you are, whatever town or country you're listening from, leave it down below for me. I read every one. An old woman likes to know the room isn't empty. Now, where was I? Yes, the arithmetic. I told myself I was imagining things. A grieving woman hears what she fears. So I made his favorite pot roast the next Sunday, and I put it out of my mind. I should not have put it out of my mind. Over that next year, the visits changed. They came less for me and more for things. Sherry would walk through the house with a slow, appraising look, lifting the lid of my mother's good casserole dish, turning over the bottom of a lamp to read the maker's mark. David started asking about money in ways that pretended not to be about money. How the retirement account was doing, whether Harold's life insurance had come through all right, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things while I was still healthy enough to enjoy it. Then one evening at supper, he said it plain. He set down his fork and he said, "Mom, I'm going to be straight with you. The business is tight right now, real tight. And there's going to be money someday anyway, when you're gone. I'm just asking if some of it could come now, when it'd actually do some good. When you're gone." He said it across my own table, over the pot roast I'd made him since he was a boy, like he was talking about a season ending. But I'll tell you something I saw in that same moment, because it matters to the end of this story. When he said it, his ears went red. They'd done that since he was small, any time he told a lie or took something that wasn't his. He couldn't look at me. His hand shook a little when he reached for his water glass. Some part of the boy I'd raised knew exactly what he was doing and hated himself for it. I saw that. I have held on to it ever since, because it's the only thing that let me forgive him later. I told him I'd help where I could, and I did. I wrote him a check for $4,000 that night. I told myself it was love. Maybe it was. But I noticed he didn't ask how I was sleeping, or whether the furnace was acting up again, or if I was lonely in that house at night. He asked only about the account. That was the first indignity. They got worse, and each one taught me something I didn't want to learn. The second came at Thanksgiving. The whole family gathered at David and Sherry's, and I brought 2 pies and a dish of my creamed onions that David had loved his whole life. Halfway through the meal, in front of everyone, in front of Sherry's parents, who I barely knew, David's brother-in-law made a joke about old people and their fat bank accounts. And David laughed. And then he looked right at me and said, "Mum doesn't even know what's in hers half the time. She still writes everything in a paper ledger." The table laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you do. But I held my own bank statement in my mind, the one I'd balanced that very week, down to the penny, and I knew exactly what was in mine. I have always known exactly what was in mine. That was the night I understood that they had decided who I was. To them, I had become a slow, foggy old woman sitting on top of money she was too dim to manage. It was a useful story for them to believe. A woman like that needs help. A woman like that can be guided. A woman like that can be handled. There was a smaller thing that happened around then that hurt in a quieter way, and I think about it more than the big ones. My granddaughter, Katie, turns 12 that spring, and they had a party. I bought her a charm bracelet, a real one, silver, that I'd saved for, and I drove over with it wrapped in tissue. But when I got there, Sherry met me at the door and said the house was full and maybe I'd be more comfortable sitting in the kitchen, out of the noise. So I sat in the kitchen, alone, for 2 hours, while my own family laughed in the next room, and I listened to a party I wasn't invited into through a doorway in a house I had helped pay the down payment on. Katie found me near the end and hugged me and loved her bracelet. She was the only one who came looking. I drove home in the dark, and I didn't cry until I was in my own driveway. And then I let myself, just for a minute, before I went inside and put the kettle on. A woman can grieve a thing and still keep her dignity. You do the crying in the car, and then you go inside, and you make your tea. What none of them remembered was what I'd done for a living. I'd spent 38 years watching exactly how money slips out of accounts when somebody decides the owner isn't paying attention. I knew the moves before they made them. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the part that truly broke my heart wasn't the money. Let me tell you what it was. That winter, I had a bad fall on the ice on my back steps. Nothing serious, a sprained wrist and a fright. But I called David from the emergency room because you call your child. I sat in that cold waiting room for 2 hours. He didn't come. He sent a text that said he was slammed with a job and could Sherry call me later. Sherry didn't call. A neighbor of mine, a widower named Frank from 2 doors down, heard about it from the pharmacy and drove me home himself. And he carried my groceries in, and he salted my steps so it wouldn't happen again. A stranger salted my steps. My son sent a text. There was one more thing that winter. Something I found in the small print of a statement, the kind most people glance at and throw away. I told no one. Not David, not Frank, not the women at church. I wrote it down in my ledger, underlined it once, and closed the cover. I didn't know yet what it would be worth to me. I only knew to keep it. I want to be fair. Even now, David was drowning. I learned later that the contracting business was buried under loans he'd taken without telling Sherry, that he'd borrowed against equipment he no longer owned, that men he owed money to had started calling the house at night. He was frightened. Frightened people do ugly things and tell themselves it's survival. I understand it. I have even forgiven it. But understanding is not the same as letting it happen to you. There was one night, during all of it, the phone rang at 11:30. I saw his name. By the time I got to it, it had stopped. No message. He called once and let it ring, and then thought better of it. I sat by that phone for an hour, waiting, hoping he'd try again, hoping he'd be calling to say none of this was real, that he was sorry, that he'd come home. He didn't call back. Whatever made him hang up that night was the last good thing in him, fighting the rest. It lost. But it was there. Because in the spring, it stopped being about loans and casseroles. In the spring, a letter came. It was from a lawyer's office in Columbus. Heavy paper. My name spelled correctly. Everything very official. I sat at my kitchen table in the morning light, and I read it twice, slowly, the way I read everything. And what it said, underneath all the careful legal words, was this. My son was petitioning a court to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. He wanted to be appointed to control my money, my house, my accounts, my decisions. He had filed for what they call a conservatorship. The grounds, the letter said, were concerns about cognitive decline and financial vulnerability. I sat very still for a long time. I did not cry. Not then. The tea in my cup went cold, and I let it. Outside, a train went by down on the river line, long and slow, and I listened to the whole of it pass. Then I got up, and I rinsed my cup, and I dried it, and I set it back in the cupboard where it belonged, and I made a phone call. Not to David, not to beg, not to ask why, not to weep into the phone the way they surely expected. I called an attorney. Her name was Diane Castellano, and she practiced elder law 2 towns over, and a friend from my church had used her when her own children turned on her. I'll tell you what Diane told me in that first meeting, because it's the hinge that everything turns on. She said, Eleanor, here is what most people in your position don't understand. A conservatorship isn't something that just happens to you. It's something a judge has to be convinced of, and the burden is on him, not on you. He has to prove you can't manage. You don't have to prove that you can. She looked at me over her glasses and she said, So, can you? I told her I had balanced ledgers for the better part of 40 years and had never once been off by $1. I told her I did the Sunday crossword in pen. I told her I knew to the cent the balance of every account I owned and the date and amount of every withdrawal my son had ever asked me for. She smiled. She said, Then they have made a very serious mistake. Now, here is where I have to tell you about the part they never saw coming. And I need you to understand that none of this was rage. It would have been easier if it were rage. Rage burns out. This was something steadier than that. This was a woman doing what she had always done, keeping the books. Years before, when Harold first got sick, he and I had signed papers naming David as a backup, a power of attorney, in case we both became unable to act. It seemed sensible then. We trusted him. We had no reason not to. And in the back of every grieving mother's mind is the thought that her child will care for her the way she cared for him. But Diane explained something to me that David, in his hurry, had forgotten to consider. A power of attorney signed by someone who is mentally competent can be revoked by that same person at any time, as long as she is still competent. And the entire foundation of David's case, the thing his whole petition stood on, was the claim that I was not competent. Do you see the trap he had built for himself? If I was too foggy to manage my money, then the court would have to take over. But the moment I walked into a lawyer's office, clear-eyed, sharp, and signed a document revoking his authority and naming Diane instead, I proved the exact opposite of what he was trying to prove. Every competent act I took was evidence against his entire case. So that is what I did, quietly, on a Thursday morning in April. I revoked the power of attorney. I changed the locks on my accounts. I had Diane request, in writing, the complete record of every interaction David had ever had with my bank, and there were several he didn't know I'd find out about. I gathered 4 decades of my own ledgers, written in my own steady hand, every page balanced. And I told no one. For 6 weeks, I let David believe I was a frightened old woman waiting to be managed. I went to the family supper in May. I smiled. I brought a peach cobbler. I let Sherry walk through my house with her appraising eyes. And the whole time, folded in a drawer in my desk, was a stack of documents that would turn the whole thing inside out. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights that spring I lay awake with the window open, listening to the trains, asking myself if I was a hard woman for not simply giving him the money and making the ugliness stop. He was my son. I had held him on the day he was born. Some nights I nearly called him just to say, "I forgive you. Come home. Let's forget all this." The cost of what I was about to do was that I might lose him for good. I knew that. I weighed it. And I decided that a son who would stand in a courtroom and call his mother feeble-minded to get at her money had already gone somewhere I could not follow. One night it got the better of me. I got up at 2 a.m, and I found the box of photographs in the den. And I sat on the floor in my nightgown and went through them. David at 6, missing a front tooth, holding up a bluegill he'd caught off the dock. David at 17 in his cap and gown. The tuition I'd earned at midnight folded invisibly into that piece of paper. David holding Katie the day she was born, his face soft in a way I hadn't seen in years. I held those pictures for a long time, and I understood something I needed to understand before I could go through with any of it. I was not doing this to punish the boy in those photographs. That boy, I would forgive anything. I was doing it to stop the man he'd become from doing this to some other old woman someday. Starting with me. You can love the child and still refuse the man. I went back to bed, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. The hearing was set for a Wednesday in June. I want to slow down here because I almost lost. I need to be honest with you about that. The courtroom was small and smelled of old paper and floor wax. David sat at one table with his lawyer, a smooth young man with a leather folder. I sat at the other with Diane. The judge was an older man named Pruitt, with reading glasses and a careful, unhurried way of speaking. And David's lawyer was good, I'll give him that. He stood up and he painted a picture. A devoted son, worried sick about his aging mother. A woman alone in a big house, recently widowed, grieving, forgetful. He brought up my fall on the ice as proof I couldn't care for myself. He brought up the paper ledgers as if writing by hand were a symptom of decline, instead of 40 years of training. And then he said the line. He looked at the judge and he said, "Your Honor, this is a woman who doesn't even read her own bank statements." I watched Judge Pruitt make a note. I watched him glance at me over his glasses, and for one terrible moment, I saw it in his face. Doubt. He was looking at a small, gray-haired woman in a navy dress, 72 years old, with folded hands, and he was wondering if maybe the son had a point. I felt the whole thing tipping. I felt the floor of it tilt under me. And it got worse before it got better. The young lawyer called my own neighbor Frank as a witness, hoping he'd describe a frail woman who needed looking after, who couldn't manage her own steps in winter. I sat very still. But Frank, God bless that man, took the stand and said, "She manages fine. The ice was ice. I've fallen on those same steps myself, and nobody's tried to take my house over it." A small laugh went around the room. It helped. But then the lawyer produced the birthday card I'd sent my granddaughter, in which my handwriting wandered a little because my wrist was still healing from the fall. And he held it up as though shaky penmanship were proof of a shaky mind. And I watched the judge look at it, and frown, and make another note. I will not pretend I wasn't afraid. I was. Everything I had built my whole life sat in that room, and for a few long minutes it could have gone either way. Diane leaned over and whispered 2 words. She said, "Stay ready." And then it was our turn. Diane did not give a speech. She did something better. She asked the judge if I might address the court myself. The young lawyer looked pleased. I think he believed I would stammer and confirm everything he'd said. The judge nodded, and I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked to the stand. And I took my seat the way I'd taken a seat at 1,000 kitchen tables to balance other people's books. The judge asked me to state my name. I did. Then Diane began to ask me questions, and this was not a performance. I did not pretend to be sharper than I was. I simply was what I had always been. She asked me the balance of my checking account. I told her to the dollar and the cent. She asked me the balance of my savings and my retirement account, and the value of Harold's life insurance, and the date each had last changed. I answered each one without pausing, the way you'd tell someone your own birthday. She asked me to explain, in my own words, how a conservatorship differs from a power of attorney. I explained it more clearly than David's lawyer had. The judge's eyebrows went up just slightly. Then Diane asked me the question we had been walking toward the whole time. She asked, "Eleanor, your son's petition says you don't read your bank statements. Is that true?" And I said, "Your Honor, I read every statement that account has ever produced. I read them the day they arrive. I balanced books for a living for 38 years, for the hardware store on Green Street, for Dr. Albright's dental practice, for a flower shop and a feed supply, and half the small businesses in this county. I have never once been off by $1. I read my statements so carefully that I can tell you my son asked me for money on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 years. And I can tell you the exact amounts because I wrote each check myself. And I recorded each one in my ledger, in ink." The room was very quiet. Then I said the thing that ended it. I reached into my handbag and took out my ledger, the real one, the one I'd kept by hand for 40 years, and I opened it to a page I'd marked. I said, "Your Honor, there's a line in here I underlined last winter and never told a soul about. It's the date a credit card was opened in my name, at a building supply store, the kind a contractor would use, that I never applied for. I closed it the day I found it. And there's a second line, from 3 months ago, the day someone tried to add their name to one of my bank accounts without my knowledge. The bank stopped that one. I have the records of both, right here. I believe the court will find them interesting. Diane handed up the document. The judge read it. He read it twice, the way I read things. Then he took off his reading glasses and he looked, for a long moment, not at me, but at my son. David would not meet his eyes. I did not gloat. There was no triumph in me, sitting in that stand. There was only a great and terrible sadness, because I was watching my own child be seen, fully, for the first time, by a stranger. And what the stranger saw was not a worried son. It was a frightened, indebted man who had tried to have his mother declared incompetent because he wanted what was hers and couldn't wait for grief to give it to him. Judge Pruitt put his glasses back on. He said the petition was not only denied, it was dismissed, and he used a word I'll remember. He called it an abuse of the court. He said in 30 years on the bench, he had rarely seen a petition so thoroughly contradicted by the person it concerned. And then he looked at me, and he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Ma'am, you've kept better records than my own office does. I'm sorry you had to be here." I thanked him, and I walked out of that courtroom on my own 2 feet, into the June sunlight, a free woman who owned everything she had walked in owning. David caught up to me in the parking lot. I'll tell you about that, because it's the part people always want to know. He was not angry anymore. The smoothness was gone. He looked like a boy who'd broken something he couldn't fix. And for a moment, I saw the child on the bleachers, and my heart did what a mother's heart always does, which is ache. He said, Mom, please. You don't understand how bad it got. They were going to take the house, the business, everything. I didn't know what else to do. And here is what I learned about myself that day. I am capable of love and clarity at the same time. They are not opposites. I said, David, I would have helped you. I did help you. All you ever had to do was sit on my porch and tell me the truth and ask me as my son. Instead, you stood in a courtroom and told a judge your mother had lost her mind. I let that sit a moment. Then I said, gently, because I meant it gently, I forgive you. I do. But I will not be managed by you. Not ever. That part is finished. He cried in that parking lot. I did not stay to watch. Some things a mother shouldn't watch, for both their sakes. Now I want to tell you what I did with the money, because this is the part that finally let me sleep again. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd packed his lunches and balanced those midnight books and read that terrible letter. And I made a decision, in pen. I went back to Diane, and together we rewrote everything. I made a will I could be proud of. I set aside a fair amount for my 2 grandchildren, to be held in trust until they were old enough to use it well, because they had done nothing wrong, and a grandmother's love shouldn't be collateral damage. And then I took the larger part, the part David had wanted, the part he'd been willing to humiliate me to reach. And I gave it a different name. There's a place in our county called the Riverside Home, a small shelter for elderly folks who have no family left, or worse, family who left them. People who got handled and managed and pushed aside, and ended up alone. I'd driven past it for years and never thought much about it. I thought about it plenty now. I endowed a fund in Harold's name, enough to keep their heat on every winter, and a good hot supper on every table for years to come. I asked for only one thing in return, which is that on the first cold night of each year, they serve pot roast. The first cold night came in November. I drove over in the blue Buick with Frank in the passenger seat, and we sat at the long table in that warm dining room with a dozen old men and women who had no one, and we ate pot roast off mismatched plates. A man named Walter, 91, who hadn't had a visitor in 3 years, told me a story about a fishing boat he'd owned in 1958, and his eyes shone the whole time. A woman named Pearl held my hand across the table and said no one had cooked for her in longer than she could remember. I thought about David, and the money, and the courtroom, and I felt the strangest thing settle over me. Not triumph, peace. The money my son had been willing to call me a fool to get had become a warm room full of people no one else had wanted. I could not have spent it better if I'd had 100 years to try. Harold would have liked it. He always did set an extra place. I am 72 years old. I still live in the small white house at the edge of Marietta, where the river bends. I still do the crossword in pen. Frank from 2 doors down checks on me, and I check on him. And last month, I taught him to make Harold's pot roast. And he wasn't half bad at it. I see my grandchildren when their mother allows it, which is more often now than it was. David and I speak sometimes. It's careful, and it's quiet, and it isn't what it was. But I haven't given up on him. I just won't be his bank, or his fool, ever again. People think the hardest thing is being betrayed by your own child. It isn't. The hardest thing is loving them anyway, and still refusing to let them make you small. Those 2 things can live in the same heart. Mine has held both for a while now, and it hasn't broken yet. I told you at the start, there was one thing 40 years of keeping the books taught me that no one can ever take, no matter how old you get. Here it is. They can question your memory. They can stand in a courtroom and call you a fool. They can decide you've grown too old to know your own mind. But they cannot make it true. You know what you have. You earned it. You signed for it. You kept the record in your own hand. So read your own statements. Sign your own name. And never let anyone, not a lawyer, not a judge, not your own child, tell you that you don't know exactly what you own. Because you do. You always did. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd stay a while and hear the next one. And tell me down in the comments, would you have forgiven him? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'll be reading every answer. I always read everything. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you again soon.